Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series, reading Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. As near as I know, there isn't anybody as would be asking very particular arter you. If you was disposed of, so I needn't take this devil and all of trouble to explain matters to you if it weren't for your own good. Do you hear me? The short and the long of what you mean, said Nancy, speaking very emphatically, and slightly frowning at Oliver as if to bespeak his serious attention to her words, is that if you're crossed by him in this job you have on hand, you'll prevent his ever telling tales afterwards by shooting him through the head, and will take your chance of swinging for it, as you do for a great many other things in the way of business, every month of your life. That's it, observed Mr. Sikes approvingly. Women can always put things in fewest words, except when it's blowing up, and then they lengthens it out. And now that he's thoroughly up to it, let's have some supper and get a snooze before starting. In pursuance of this request, Nancy quickly laid the cloth. Disappearing for a few minutes, she presently returned with a pot of porter and a dish of sheep's heads, which gave occasion to several pleasant witticisms on the part of Mr. Sikes, founded upon the singular coincidence of Jemmy's being a canned name, common to them and also to an ingenious implement, much used in his profession. Indeed, the worthy gentleman, stimulated perhaps by the immediate prospect of being on active service, was in great spirits and good humour, in proof whereof it may be here remarked that he humorously drank all the beer at a draught, and did not utter, on a rough calculation, more than 80 oaths during the whole progress of the meal. Supper being ended, it may be easily conceived that Oliver had no great appetite for it. Mr. Sikes disposed of a couple of glasses of spirits and water, and threw himself on the bed, ordering Nancy, with many imprecations in case of failure, to call him at 5 precisely. Oliver stretched himself in his clothes, by command of the same authority, on a mattress upon the floor, and the girl, mending the fire, sat before it, in readiness to rouse them at the appointed time. For a long time Oliver lay awake, thinking it not impossible that Nancy might seek that opportunity of whispering some further advice, but the girl sat brooding over the fire, without moving, save now and then to trim the light. Weary with watching and anxiety, he at length fell asleep. When he awoke, the table was covered with tea things, and Sikes was thrusting various articles into the pockets of his greatcoat, which hung over the back of a chair. Nancy was busily engaged in preparing breakfast. It was not yet daylight, for the candle was still burning, and it was quite dark outside. A sharp rain, too, was beating against the window panes, and the sky looked black and cloudy. Now then, growled Sikes, as Oliver started up. 5:30. Look sharp, or you'll get no breakfast, for it's late as it is. Oliver was not long in making his toilet. Having taken some breakfast, he replied to a surly inquiry from Sikes by saying that he was quite ready. Nancy, scarcely looking at the boy, threw him a handkerchief to tie round his throat. Sykes gave him a large, rough cape to button over his shoulders. Thus attired, he gave his hand to the robber, who, merely pausing to show him, with a menacing gesture, that he had the same pistol in a side pocket of his greatcoat, clasped it firmly in his, and, exchanging a farewell with Nancy, led him away. Oliver turned for an instant, when they reached the door, in the hope of meeting a look from the girl, but she had resumed her old seat in front of the fire, and sat perfectly motionless before it. Chapter 21. The Expedition. It was a cheerless morning when they got into the street, blowing and raining hard, and the clouds looking dull and stormy. The night had been very wet. Large pools of water had collected in the road, and the kennels were overflowing. There was a faint glimmering of the coming day in the sky, but it rather aggravated than relieved the gloom of the scene, the somber light only serving to pale that which the street lamps afforded, without shedding any warmer or brighter tints upon the wet house tops and dreary streets. There appeared to be nobody stirring in that quarter of the town. The windows of the houses were all closely shut, and the streets through which they passed were noiseless and empty. By the time they had turned into the Bethnal Green Road, the day had fairly begun to break. Many of the lamps were already extinguished. A few country wagons were slowly toiling on towards London. Now and then, a stage-coach covered with mud rattled briskly by, the driver bestowing as he passed an admonitory lash upon the heavy wagoner who, by keeping on the wrong side of the road, had endangered his arriving at the office a quarter of a minute after his time. The public houses with gas lights burning inside were already open. By degrees other shops began to be unclosed, and a few scattered people were met with. Then came straggling groups of laborers going to their work, then men and women with fish baskets on their heads, donkey carts laden with vegetables, chaise carts filled with livestock, or whole carcasses of meat, milk women with pails, and an unbroken concourse of people, trudging out with various supplies to the eastern suburbs of the town. As they approached the city, the noise and traffic gradually increased. When they threaded the streets between Shoreditch and Smithfield, it had swelled into a roar of sound and bustle. It was as light as it was likely to be, till night came on again, and the busy morning of half the London population had begun. Turning down Sun Street and Crown Street, and crossing Finsbury Square, Mr. Sykes struck, by way of Chiswell Street, into Barbican, thence into Long Lane, and so into Smithfield, from which latter place arose a tumult of discordant sounds that filled Oliver Twist with amazement. It was market morning. The ground was covered, nearly ankle deep, with filth and mire, a thick steam, perpetually rising from the reeking bodies of the cattle, and mingling with the fog, which seemed to rest upon the chimney tops, hung heavily above. All the pens in the center of the large area, and as many temporary pens as could be crowded into the vacant space, were filled with sheep. Tied up to posts by the gutter side were long lines of beasts and oxen, 3 or 4 deep. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thievers, idlers, and vagabonds of every low grade were mingled together in a mass. The whistling of drovers, the barking dogs, the bellowing and plunging of the oxen, the bleating of the sheep, the grunting and squealing of pigs, the cries of hawkers, the shouts, oaths, and quarreling on all sides, the ringing of bells and roar of voices that issued from every public house, the crowding, pushing, driving, beating, whooping, and yelling, the hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid, and dirty faces constantly running to and fro and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene which quite confounded the senses. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.